All right, well, it's 1:40, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to another edition of our Friday seminar. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker, Anne Brown. Anne is an assistant professor in the School of Planning, Public Policy, and Management at the University of Oregon. She researches issues of transportation equity, shared mobility, travel behavior. We've done work together on public transit and ride hailing. We're going to talk about micromobility today. She has got a master's degree in urban and regional planning and a PhD in urban planning from UCLA. And on a personal note, Anne is one of my longest transportation academic friends. We met when I was a PhD student and she was a master's student applying but not attending UC Berkeley. I'll still read you for that. So anyway, without further ado, let's welcome Anne.
Thanks, Jesus. And hi all, it's great to be with you. I'm delighted to be back in California. I'll be back with you all. It's been a bit since I was last at Davis for about 5 or so years. So it's so nice to see the sunshine since I'm coming down from Oregon. It's been very restorative. I was just saying I was so tired of the winter being here. And luckily I was delivered to California. So very happy to be with you all. Very happy to be here discussing equity and micromobility. So I'm looking forward to our discussion. Some of you here for lunch. I think we already got that going, but I'm excited to hear from more of you as well. So today, when I'm going to talk about 3 buckets. Spend some time talking about what is equity and micromobility. So how might we think about that? What are the different dimensions? I'll define for you all what specific dimension of equity I'll be focusing on today, because we probably all here have slightly different conceptualizations of what would we be interested in related to equity and micromobility. I'll talk about what are cities doing. So I want to take a deep dive in the programmatic side about equity in micromobility planning. And then I'll wrap up with some future directions to get your brain spinning and thinking about what else do we need to know? Where else should we be exploring going forward? Thinking about how to actually implement equity in micromobility and in practice itself. Okay, so why micromobility? So my own personal interest is not in the technology itself. My interest in micromobility is really from the traveler side, thinking about how do you get people to cross space? What does access to opportunities look like? What is mobility for people? And how might that change with micromobility? And so, as all students of transportation, I like to think about micromobility as, is it a tool that we can really use to fill existing gaps in our systems? So our transportation systems are very far from perfect, right? They're a product of a whole host of decades-long trends, systemic racism, differences in how we're funding and where we're putting that funding over time. And so what about micromobility? Is it perpetuating those same trends? Or can it be used to bridge some of those existing gaps that we haven't filled with other modes? So big question. It also is an opportunity to ask questions about communities. And so oftentimes, and this is some of the lunch discussion, was thinking about, do communities actually need or want micromobility, right? So there's sometimes a question, cities are really excited about these new modes, saying, let's give everyone a bike or a scooter. Well, these open an opportunity to say, do communities want a bike or a scooter, or what else do they really need? Is it infrastructure related? Is it transit related? Is it something else entirely? It also raises questions about infrastructure gaps. So in some cases, micromobility raises funds. So cities collect fees from companies. Those can then be used to build infrastructure. Some cities do, some cities don't. It's kind of unclear where on the aggregate scale funds from micromobility companies go. But you could take a deeper dive in looking at those investments in infrastructure and also taking a more critical look at where existing infrastructure exists. If you're putting scooters in a neighborhood, for example, and people aren't riding them, why? One reason might be that there's safety issues and isn't a proper infrastructure. And then I'm going to give you a brief example before diving into some specific city goals. But I think micromobility often is a chance for us to think more broadly about what goals do we have for our cities, specifically our rights of way. Right? We have limited space in our public right of ways, so streets and sidewalks. What do we actually want to achieve with those? And again, to give you a brief dive into this, but also plug some other, one of my favorite other things to research in micromobility, which is parking. And as Jesus mentioned, I'm a product of UCLA, which is probably the parking central with Donald Shoup there. So of course I love thinking about parking in all dimensions. But I think for micromobility specifically, parking is a really interesting way to think about what are our priorities for cities. And parking is a huge issue in micromobility. There's a lot of tension and public debate around how often are scooters and bikes misparked. And I want you to think in your mind, what percentage of scooters do you think are impeding access in cities? So I know they're not here, but imagine elsewhere in cities you've been, what percentage of scooters are blocking access for other travelers? And I will say that I have been surveying transportation professionals all over the world about this. And usually people say somewhere between 30 to 90%. So if you're in that range, you're in very good company. In actuality, we've done a bunch of field observations and found it's closer to between 0 and 8%, depending on the city. Now, this is not every time of day, it's not every single street in cities, it's a cross-section look at different cities. These are specifically, are they blocking access by other travelers? It's an important question, right? Even a single scooter that blocks access for someone walking or rolling down the sidewalk is a problem. But it's important to remember that scooters exist in a broader context. So in the same streets, we also looked at cars. Much bigger problems. And so a huge share of cars, about a third-ish on average, were improperly parked. They're blocking access to things like bike lanes. Probably a lot of us have seen, say, a truck or a car just idling in a bike lane, people getting on and off, Grubhub, etc. Could be people parking right next to fire hydrants, which is a safety hazard. It could be parking across sidewalks. It could be parking in spaces reserved for people using disabled placards. There's a whole host of misparking by cars that sometimes we don't see because we're so used to cars on our rights of way. So I think it's worth thinking about, is this a problem? Yes, but they're operating in a much bigger context. And so what are our goals with regulating things like scooter parking? If it's about access and free access on our, say, sidewalks, we should be thinking much more broadly. So thinking about managing cars, thinking about things like sandwich boards, which are in the middle of sidewalks. And when we, for example, in this study, so again, this is with a number of colleagues, went out and actually measured things, what is blocking access on sidewalks, sandwich boards and other furniture objects were blocking sidewalks about as often as scooters. And yet there is not a public outcry that I hear about this type of thing. Right? So thinking bigger, closed sidewalks, construction, fun things like poles in the middle of sidewalks or vegetation. I'm currently, sidewalks I have to admit are also my current pet issues. I'm in the middle of doing a sidewalk audit, Eugene, which is all about looking at all the bad sidewalks. And so I'm just very fixated on sidewalks right now. But also how broken are sidewalks, right? It doesn't matter if there's a scooter on this and you can't actually get over these bumps and these cracks. Are there curb cuts? What do those curb cuts look like if they exist? Are they shooting you out in the middle of a intersection? So again, when we think about micromobility, regulating them for things like access is very important, but so is remembering the broader context and not getting so tunnel visioned about micromobility that we're forgetting the bigger goals that they can help be part of. So that's my broad pitch for thinking about them in a broader context. I want to zoom in and focus on programs specifically. So thinking about, a lot of cities have broad goals around equity. What is it looking like in the micromobility context? What are people implementing in terms of policy, and what are they actually doing? So again, thinking about some definitions. So a lot of things that differ across cities are thinking about equity for whom and how. And so we might think about it a couple different ways. Two ways to think about equity is we could think about opportunity equity. And that's thinking about, are there bikes and scooters, for example, nearby people? Does everyone have the option to use these vehicles? It's very different than outcome equity, which is really looking at how are people using them, or how often are people using them? You might have a scooter right next to you, but can you access it, right? Is it physically accessible? Is it financially accessible, technologically accessible? And there's a lot of potential barriers, even when you might be right next to it. These are two pieces to think about. And then the other side is thinking about neighborhoods and individuals. And so you could look at access across space and be thinking about what does it look like in neighborhoods with different characteristics, be that density, be that race, ethnicity, income of residents, or is it about the people? And so far, most cities are focusing on these two. So opportunity, thinking about where are we actually putting vehicles and are we giving people the option to use them? And then focusing on the neighborhood level outcomes, looking where trips are, for example, across space. And that's largely because they're not collecting data on individuals, which from a data, individual privacy perspective could be great. But it can be tricky when you want to know, for example, how are people of different incomes using these services? At the neighborhood level, you don't know if a trip taken in a neighborhood that has a lower median household income is serving someone who is earning a lower income, right? Or maybe it's someone who's bar hopping in an area that has lower median household income. So a lot of questions you can't answer with a big neighborhood level. So often we think about, I'll come back to this and think about what data, et cetera, are we collecting. We're often not collecting data that allows us to answer a lot of these outcome related questions and individual based questions. So in some ways our understanding of equity and micromobility is limited, right? As so many things are in our understanding of the world. Okay, so I'm going to present a big look at nationally what are cities and agencies around the US doing in terms of trying to operationalize equity in micromobility, looking specifically at programs. So e-scooter programs, bike share programs, and then joint micromobility programs. So some cities operate a just shared micromobility program that includes both scooters and bike share, and they're regulated by they have the same regulations. Okay, so this is a collaboration with two of my colleagues. One is Amanda Howell at Oregon Department of Transportation, and one is Hannah at Green Mining. So it was a collaboration that wrapped up last year. And I think interesting lessons and thinking about the future as well. So again, one of the things when we were thinking on in this process was, how do we track, we're thinking about equity in this either opportunity or outcome, how do we track it really from the conception of a program all the way through to the end? And so one thing I'm not going to talk too much about today is what are the goals of the program? What does it actually hope to do? Sometimes goals, you think about transit agencies as well, you might have 20 different goals. Those goals aren't always in alignment. They could be at odds, right? So trying to achieve one goal might be counter to achieving another. Things like increasing mobility and yet reducing greenhouse gas, those could be counterproductive, right? So what are the goals of systems? How many actually mention equity? These varied a lot across agencies. A lot didn't have any concrete goals, some had very clear concrete goals. Some related to equity, some not. So big mixed bag here. I'm not going to talk too much about these. One thing I will talk a little bit more about is how do you connect any goals you have for your program to the actual design of the program? So the implementation of that. What does the program itself look like? This is what I'll spend a lot of time today talking about. So what does that program actually include? What are the components, etc.? Then you have program components. What data are you actually collecting about your program? How do you actually understand that program? Again, are you collecting data at the trip level, neighborhood level, individual level, characteristics about the origin and destination, data about who's using the program? A lot of programs, for example, have reduced rate programs. People are paying less per trip, but the cities or agencies don't know how many people are using it, right? So again, there's this often information and understanding gap in how people are using the equity programs that are even in place. So what data are we collecting? And then the evaluation side. So once we collect data, our program's actually being evaluated to understand how people are using them, who's using them, et cetera. And then what happens to that evaluation? Does it go sit and collect dust on a shelf? Or is it part of an iterative process that feeds back into changing goals and reevaluating, redesigning programs? I will say that one benefit of these short, often micromobility comes in as 1 or 2 year pilot programs. One benefit of that one challenge of that seems to be that city staff are exhausted by that continual process of evaluating applications and
vetting them and processing them, et cetera. One benefit seems to be that they allow for iteration over time. Some cities have really taken advantage of that. Okay, I'm going to focus largely on these three pieces. So it's program design side, data collection and evaluation. And I'm going to answer two questions for you all, which is just what are the equity requirements of shared mobility? So we knew that they were out there. We knew that some places were doing some things. We didn't have a good sense of what did that actually mean? What did that look like? And then how are the programs are actually evaluated and monitored? If you're implementing something, how do you know if it works? If it's working, great. Let's figure out how to do more of that. If it's not working, that's okay. Let's figure out how to change it. But if you don't evaluate, you don't know whether to change something or not, or what's working, what's not. Okay, so to answer this, we collected data from about 240 shared micromobility programs across the country. We collected requirements specifically, so we wanted to know what did cities require, not what was their wish list, but what must service providers have on the ground in order to actually operate somewhere. So we really were looking for language like must, shall, should. We were not looking for things like, we would love to see this. This would be cool to see. And that's largely because when we talk to staff about this, a lot of times staff use that language, the preferential language, as almost like a float test to see, can these companies provide this? We're not sure. Let's test, let's see if we can use this as a way to see if we can in the future make this a requirement, or this would be nice to have, but really we care about these things the most. So there's a couple strategies behind there, but largely we really focused on what were they focused on, what were they prioritizing in their policy. Okay, so it's a very long, about year and a half data collection. This field evolves constantly, so it's very aggravating, trying to, it's kind of like whack-a-mole, trying to keep these data up to date. They're probably already out of date, just because of the fast-moving nature of this field. But in general, we looked at program websites, we read a lot of contract language, requests for proposals, we talked to staff, we read rulemaking documents, and collected all those requirements from a variety of sources. A caveat is we're not including university programs. We're just looking at city or public-based programs. So university programs tend to be a bit different in their structure. They're not necessarily looking at the same equity-based groups that maybe the whole city might be looking at. So we did exclude those. Those are not included in our database. Okay, so another couple other caveats. Again, keeping in mind programs evolve over time. So this is a snapshot in time. I expect this to change. If it didn't change, that would probably be a problem. They're also shaped by local constraints often. So a lot of times there's a lot more nuance that happens behind the scenes of a, do you have something, yes or no? There's a lot of reasons why often goes behind the scenes. So that's not something I'll be getting into too much today. But sometimes it had to do with things like smaller municipalities said, we didn't feel like we could ask for that much. We didn't feel like we could require that much because we worried we wouldn't get anyone to apply to operate in our market. So it was interesting to see how some of those local dynamics played out in terms of what they then required from an equities perspective. And then I'm not gonna, again, happy to get into this Q&A. I'm not gonna get too much into any kind of case study and detailed information about specific cities today, but I have a whole report available if you really, really want to dig in, or I'm happy to get into some more specifics in the Q&A. I do want to share this, which again, I think these slides or recording will be available after. It's a QR code. We have an interactive dashboard of all the data, the 240 programs. It's all hosted online, and so you can select things like, do you want to look at bikeshare? Do you want to look at scooters? Do you want to look at both? Or maybe you want to look at all the programs that have reduced rates. So we have an interactive dashboard that will all filter and be dynamic to your interests. And then at the bottom, there's this huge collective, this big data table that you can actually look at the specific language in cities as well. So you can look up what is the language actually used in different places. So please use this. We're excited that it's live and useful. For any cities that stumble across this, we have a place for them to fill out a brief, basically a survey to say, hey, update me, my data's out of date, because we expect that to change over time. So again, plug for the original data, freely available, please enjoy and use. Okay, so what does equity actually look like in practice? Starting with process equity, we're really interested in that. How does it look like before a program actually goes into practice? And so we looked at targeted marketing and outreach. So were firms requiring companies to go to specific communities, and sometimes those were named, like actual neighborhood names were in contracts or in the RFPs. Sometimes it was things like you must go to neighborhoods with median household incomes below X. And sometimes there were very broad requirements about you must do this. Sometimes it was very prescriptive, like you have to go 5 times per year and document who attends. So we arrange, but only about a third, a little less than a third required this at all. Overall, I should have said this first, about 60% of programs required any equity requirements at all. So at least one, 60%, so far from all. Half, about a little less than half, had at least 2 or more. So if you think about things like intersectional barriers, so many people might not face one barrier, they might face multiple. It can be important to have more than one requirement or equity, something to overcome different barriers. So having a reduced fare, for example, might not be sufficient to then tackle other barriers people might be facing. So thinking about the nature of those is important, how they might be intersectional as well. So a third, a little less than a third, targeted marketing and outreach, this process side. And we looked at a bunch of implementation side. Again, these are all part of the program design piece, but this is really what is actually getting put on the ground. How are users then accessing the bikes and scooters that are on the ground in front of them? So smartphone alternatives was the most common. About a third of programs had this. And again, remember when I said that 60% have at least one? That means they might have smartphone, but they might have had process. So all of these are going to be far below 60. Not all of the programs had any of these or all of these alternatives. So smartphone alternatives, often this looked like things like, can you text to unlock a vehicle? Could you integrate with a transit card? You could tap on the back of a vehicle. Those are the 2 most common alternatives we saw. Oftentimes, though, the RSPs would just say, you must provide an alternative, go figure it out. So it wasn't very prescriptive. About a third also required a cash option. Again, this varied a lot in what they required, and probably the reality of trying to use cash on board or to rent or to access a scooter or bike. So in some cases, for example, you could load cash on a card at anyone at a 7-Eleven or a lot of these different commercial community spots. Other times, however, you had to go in person to an office that was open 3 hours once a week. So, again, realistically on the ground, is this making a difference? It's a good question. We aren't collecting the data to know. But again, huge range in what this really looks like. Reduced rate, again, about a third reduced rate, and I'll show you some language in a bit of some differences between the broad compared to very prescriptive and narrow language that cities use for this. Geographic, 30% of programs require some kind of geographic requirement. That was usually either tied to a number of vehicles or a percentage of vehicles and how they were then distributed across space. So sometimes, again, the city would call out specific neighborhoods or areas and say, you must provide 20% of vehicles in this area. Some were also very nuanced about saying you must provide 20%, and that has to be that throughout the day or at the beginning of each day. So they would say, not like every week, it would be very, very prescriptive again on how often. Some were much broader. Yeah, they would name income levels or other thresholds, thinking about that geographic distribution. About a quarter required multiple languages. And again, ranged a lot, often reflected local context. Sometimes was one other language, sometimes was 5 or 6. Sometimes it specified where that other language had to be. It could be in the app. It could be that they required multilingual customer service telephone lines. It could be that they required multilingual websites, right? So sometimes they specified different areas that those different languages had to be accessible. Sometimes they didn't. And the last one, only 5% of programs required adaptive vehicles. So when I mentioned this, some of you were at lunch. Typically what this looked like was not adaptive vehicles scattered throughout a city. This was typically, they require the private mobility companies to then partner with, say, a bike shop or another nonprofit to provide that access. So to tailor the adaptive vehicles to individual needs and to recognize that people require a whole range of different bike or scooter configurations to meet their needs. And so oftentimes these weren't, again, not scattered throughout the community, but it was usually a long-term loan basis that was covered, the cost of it being covered by the micromobility company. But again, very, very small percentage of companies here. So implementation side. And then of course, once you implement a program, you can evaluate it. Most programs, this was by far and away the biggest requirement, most universal across programs, was requiring data, some form of data from the companies. All of what I've been presenting so far has been lumped in e-scooters and bike share. E-scooters is about 98%. So bike share programs overall in our sample tend to be a little older. There tend to be more models of operations, so more things like nonprofit run or city run as well. There seems to be also a lot of learning from bike share and ride hail, so a lot of understanding of this shared economy and shared mobility. And so with scooters coming in a lot, there's almost universal data requirements. Yeah.
The data sharing requirement, that is meant for data sharing with the government? Or-
Yes,
Okay.
data sharing with government. So it's not saying the private user has to share with the
Private
company. Yes, thanks for the clarifying question. It means that they, the scooter company or the bike share company, must share the data with the government. And oftentimes the request for proposals outline very specific formats for the data. They say, you know, it has to be in GTFS specification and it needs to be, you know, hour, minute. I mean, they specify the format sometimes, they specify the frequency at which it must be delivered. They often specify that the companies must provide the data on demand, should they ask. It typically also specifies things like privacy, like no data can be disclosed about individuals, but again, has usually a standard, not standard, but similar components related to frequency and the types of data that have to be delivered to the city. So very common on the data side. However, once they receive the data, only about a quarter have a public facing evaluation report. That's not to say that there's not internal understanding of the data or they haven't thought through the data, but at least on the public side, only about a quarter have an evaluation report. So what happens to all these data, right, is a little more questionable. How much is it then being synthesized and then brought into a next iteration of practice? We also looked at questions like how many had equity related enforcement, and by that I mean enforcement of the micromobility companies, not of individuals. Meaning that if a company fails to meet its equity objectives, what happens? And so a lot of places, as you can see, 85% didn't say anything related to equity. Other ones tied performance of related to their equity requirements to things like getting more vehicles or losing vehicles that they could deploy in a city. That was the most common use. Sometimes they would say simply, you will lose eligibility to have a contract renewed if you do not comply and continue to meet your equity requirements. But again, we were interested to see it. Do these requirements have teeth? Do they actually, is there some heft behind them? What happens if you don't fulfill these? Or are they just on paper just because? Okay. Here's an example of what Sacramento includes, just an example of, again, how this might look in practice. So all the lighter greens are ones that Sacramento does not have. This is the bike share system. The dark are ones that they do. Okay, so you can see that many cities, some had one, some in this case, we didn't count this as an equity requirement. This is data sharing, does not count. So they had 3. Okay, so you can see some had 3, some had 8 or 9. I guess it's not 8, 3, 7. Some had all 7. So it really varied by place. And again, 60% had at least 1, 45 had 2 or more. Okay. And you think about who also might be left out if you don't have these pieces there as well. So you might be bringing some groups in, but still others might not have access. And 2 quotes I'll show you just from the regulatory guidelines, just to illustrate again the nuance and the differences across these programs. This is related to the reduced fare. And so this one For example, this is from Austin. You can see it says, has to apply to any income level at or below 200% poverty, 200% of the federal poverty guidelines. So it has to be quote unquote an affordable option. Okay, not sure what that means exactly. It's a little squishy, right? But they've set a level for kind of income rate, and it has to apply to customers earning below that. That's different than SFMTA, who very clearly specifies that low-income user plans must offer a 50% fare discounts. They've specified what discount must be applied, or unlimited trips under 30 minutes to riders earning below 200% of the poverty guidelines. So very different approaches. And this is pretty illustrative of all of the different requirements, how different places took very different approaches. So some very, very specific and exacting in their language, and some broad strokes, leaving a lot of discretion either up to the companies themselves or perhaps later discussion between city staff, but not in the regulatory language. Okay, so from this, we came away with some promising practices, thinking about how to implement micromobility practices in programs. Again, remembering that this is just within the programs, there's all these much, much bigger questions around micromobility equity that we haven't talked through. Again, do communities want them, for example? What's the broader context that they're operating in? All sorts of questions around this. But when you look at when programs have been implemented, a couple of promising practices. Linking operational incentives to desired equity outcomes seem to be very positive. We did a number of interviews with city staff, and they felt that this was a very effective strategy, saying, you know, if you do X, if you fulfill X, then you can continue to exist in our city, or you can get more vehicles, for example, in our city, which means greater market share. There were some concerns among city staff that companies would do things like, not sure how to put this, legal some of their reporting or practices to meet some of those requirements in an artificial way, like do mass signups for people under, say, if they're required to meet a certain number of people enrolled in a reduced fare program, that they would go out to the community and have people sign up, but those people had no intention of using it, but maybe they'd pay people like, hey, we'll give you $5 if you sign up for our company. So there's some definitely questionable challenges in practice that I will not, none of the micromobility providers confirmed, but this was some anecdote from city staff concerns. So again, being really clear in how those, you know, what your requirements are and how companies will meet those is important. Dedicated staff and time resources to manage programs is very important. So staff are constantly have too little bandwidth, right? There are a million things on their plates. Really paying attention to these programs and ensuring that they're clearly evaluated and iterated and thoughtfully processed, and you've engaged with the community to think about what really are their needs. Maybe it's micromobility, maybe it's not, but if it is micromobility, what does that look like? Right, that takes a lot of time to do the outreach, a lot of time to you know, engage with potential community leaders about this to help raise awareness, for example. And the staff we talked to who had the capacity to do that often felt very passionately about this, and it was very clear on the ground that the program was different and had a lot more just touch time and was much more robust. Not because of the requirements listed on paper. The requirements on paper looked in some cases similar to other places, but it's sometimes that qualitative aspect, the staff dedication. Again, you can't do that if you don't have time and capacity to spend dedicated to a specific program. Ensuring a clear arc connecting specific goals with program requirements is important. So I know I didn't talk too much about goals, but I want to show you this crosswalk we created. So what this shows is all these program components at the top that I talked through what cities have, what they don't. And then over here, this is all these rows are goals. So you can have user-based goals. What groups do you want to be able to access the modes, for example? These are just examples. You can have a whole range of goals. Opportunity-based goals, access to what types of amenities or opportunities, and then perhaps environment-based goals. You have a lot of different goals for your program. We found sometimes that people might have goals like, we want to ensure that people earning low incomes can access our services. but then they didn't have any requirements related to reduced fares. And so there's this mismatch sometimes between these big goals we have for programs and actually the reality or the likelihood that they might achieve those in practice. And so the green here indicate kind of must have. This is absolutely essential. You want to have a program component that supports these goals, versus the yellow is this is also important, but perhaps not as critical. So again, looking at the low income, if a goal is to support use by people earning low incomes, having a reduced fare or a low income rate, pretty important. As is a cash payment option, that has to do with literature on things like unbanked households and use of cash. And then other things that are important, but potentially slightly less so, things like geographic distribution. Targeting neighborhood is a blunt instrument, but can be potentially effective. And then a smartphone alternative. Smartphones, there's less disparity across income compared to across age, for example, but also think about things like you have an app, what are its data requirements, right? A lot of people who are earning lower incomes have smartphones, but maybe not reliable data plans. And so really thinking about that full picture is also important. So again, some tools and thinking about how do these program goals actually connect to practice. Okay, matching program requirements to targeted data collection to enable evaluation. Again, one of the goals we actually had for this project starting out was we wanted to know what the outcomes were in practice. And we found through doing this research, we couldn't answer that question because the cities weren't collecting the data. We needed to answer these questions. And so thinking really about what do you need to know to understand the equity implications and outcomes of your program, make sure you're then collecting them. One really promising practice we saw was because cities would require trips be reported, so the actual trip data be reported, they didn't know who was using it. It can be really, really time and resource intensive to try to survey scooter users or bike share users. So what some cities were starting to require is the city would design a survey, but they required their micromobility provider to send it out to users at least once a year. In that way, the user, the micromobility platform is doing that legwork. They already know who's using it, so they can reach them very easily, essentially zero cost. But the city then can answer all the questions they have. So the control is still with the city, but they're providing, kind of making the companies do that legwork or doing that outreach piece. And that's not collecting data from people who aren't using the system, which would be a really critical piece of this puzzle. But certainly from the goals of who's using the program, this can be a big step. And then last but not least, conducting transparent evaluations to actually measure progress. It can be scary as a city to implement programs and realize you're not meeting your goals. That's a hard finding, but it also brings an opportunity to adjust it so you can better meet those goals. So you can't find out what you're doing well, what's not working as well until you evaluate it. So kind of closing that full loop so then you can iterate it back to improve the program for the next time around. Lots of potential here for the micromobility space. And then as you all move forward, or as as a researcher, I always think, what else don't we know, right? What else can I answer questions around? But as you all move forward, thinking about micromobility and equity, I think the next big step is really what are those outcomes, right? We have a lot of on paper. What does that actually mean on the ground? Right now, we don't have the data to collect that. There's potential to do that. But again, some shortcomings in what we can answer right now. And then focusing on both the individuals and the neighborhood level. So you need answers to both of those to really understand the full dimensions of equity. And then again, remembering, kind of going back to the beginning when I talked about parking, remembering to situate micromobility within broader goals related to equity. So transportation is never a silo. Bikes and scooters are never in a silo. How does that fit in all of our broader goals as well? We're removing some blinders on thinking about just the scooters and bikes themselves and thinking, what do we actually want to achieve with these? And how does that change how we shape programs? With that, thank you all. And I'm looking forward to our questions.
Thanks, Ed. We'll start with questions here in the room and then we'll check to see.
Well, this is not a question, but in the initial stage, you mentioned that how these e-scooters try to block the sidewalks and other paths. So I just wanted to quote one thing that I saw back in India. I was staying for a short period in Bangalore, it's city in India, and they had just introduced this e-scooter program. It was basically dockless, And what people used to do, they used to like take the scooter from one part of the city and like leave it anywhere in the middle of the road, on the sidewalks, or anywhere they would like. And that kept blocking the traffic and everything. But what they found out is that they marked some spots in the city that were like very dense, where the scooter needs to be left if you want to end the ride. So suppose I go to this spot and I leave the scooter in front of my house, and I don't park it in this spot where the scooter needs to be parked, which is mostly near to all the destinations that they have mapped the scooter trips are generally. So the scooter ride does not end, and the money keeps on deducting from my account. So after that, the people started parking the scooters in these areas, and that reduced the like parking on the sidewalks or illegally on some other places, and that kind of solved the problem.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, so thinking about the different interventions that cities have, so I've done other research on this. So specifically with Nick Klein from Cornell and then Calvin Thigpen's at Lyme, is a UC Davis grad. So shout out to Calvin. And so we did an experimental study in Auckland, New Zealand, and then DC, looking at, you know, if you provide spaces, what happens, or, you know, does that change how people park? And so with the caveat that with my first graphic show, there's a really small percentage of scooters that are misparked to begin with. And by misparked again, I mean impeding access. There's this whole host of regulations that vary by city that are so opaque to users. There's no way I expect anyone to know what these regulations are. And there are things like it can be parked on grass, but not landscaping. And on the other city, it can't be parked on grass. And it can be parked next to a pole, but not if it's a regulatory pole. Or it can be parked next to a pole, but only if it's above 6 feet tall. I mean, it is mind blowing. I don't expect anyone to actually know or follow those minutiae. So sometimes you'll see reporting like 50% of scooters are misparked according to local regulations. Well, of course, because no one knows what those local regulations are. In my mind, at least, the regulations really matter, the access ones. Like, can you actually maintain space for other travelers in the right way? Anyway, so we did a couple different interventions. We did an app-based messaging one. We did there were already some demarcated corrals, but we did little decals on the side that said, hey, there's a designated parking space 50 feet that way, head over there. And then we, just by chance, DC was instituting a lock to requirement. And so we extended our data collection a bit longer and saw how did that change behaviors. And with both the app and the decal, we found there was a little bit of movement here and there, like a little movement into those spaces. Not a huge change, some statistically significant, but again, small, because there wasn't much to move from, because not many people were parking in the middle of the sidewalk to begin with. In the lock two, we saw the biggest change in where people were parking, which perhaps is not surprising. So people were parking mostly just in the furniture zone, just anywhere next to benches and bike racks, et cetera. And now they were all, many more people parked at bike racks. That's where they're required to lock two. But lock two is interesting. So on one hand, it solves this issue, which a lot of the public doesn't like scooters because they're not tidy. So for example, if you have scooters that all parked parallel to one another, people say, yeah, that looks good. If you have them totally out of the way, but parked like this, people hate it, right? So it's interesting, there's a disconnect between what's blocking the right of way and what do people perceive as tidy, and how the public likes or doesn't like scooters and bikes, mostly scooters. Bikes, they think park much better than scooters. But when we were looking at, when you think about the lock two, so it can solve this aesthetic piece. It's also tricky from an equity perspective because you have to think about where is infrastructure to lock scooters to. And for example, when you look at where, if you're requiring people to block to bike racks and you have fewer bike racks in certain neighborhoods, are you going to be penalizing people financially for not being able to park next to them? So I think it's a challenge when we think about implementing some of these requirements at a citywide scale. And some cities have actually said we don't want lock to requirements because we don't have enough bike racks. So it's this interesting mix about city dynamics and thinking about what works, how to encourage people to park in different ways. But yeah, thanks for sharing that example. Carrie.
And I was surprised about your finding of how many of the agreements required data, because as someone who does research in this area, like this is what you hear over and over again, is that we can't get the data that we need to truly understand. Is there a broad range of sort of what that means, like in some cases, the city just wanted like an overall number of, X scooters are being used per year or whatever like that. As opposed to the kind of data we would actually want to be able to answer interesting travel behavior questions.
There is a big range, and some specifically say we only want this on a dashboard and we want you to clean it all up for us, and we don't want the raw data. And some very clearly articulate the variables they want, frequency with which they want them. And if you want to see what each program actually requires in the database you can download, it says all the different data requirements.
Oh, cool.
So you can dig in and see.
Okay.
I mean, some of these were like pages long of
Yeah.
the data they were requiring, and some were very generic, like we must report data once a year, and like the number of trips, and they'd have like 3 data points versus origin, destination, and more of a spreadsheet style or database style reporting. So yeah, huge range in there for sure. But certainly the companies are capable of providing the more detailed level. And I think one of my hopes for the database is cities that might not know what they can ask for or what could be required. This can be a tool, and you can look at it and say, hey, so and so city are all getting this, us too. And so providing some more power and data collection capabilities. But then there's also this question of staff time, like maybe they can partner with a researcher, but do the staff themselves have the capacity or capability of analyzing thousands or millions of trips? Is another question.
In terms of data, are the companies in any way capturing income, race, gender, that maybe then after that could be shared? And then the other question I had about like surveys, you did say they're not usually surveying people that are not using it, but then how do they survey maybe the non-app based users, and do they get information from them as well?
Yeah, good questions. So one, no, the companies don't, or at least they say they don't, survey the users, and they don't share it. And I think most of the time they actually don't, because they don't want to have to share it on, I'm not sure. But the cities themselves are collecting that information. It's subject to any type of survey bias. So, right, you think about what percentage of people are actually responding to the survey. It's hard to know what that underlying population might look like, so who might not be answering the survey, because it's likely your scooter riders, for example, look different than your general population in general. So it's hard to know who you're missing from that survey. And then in terms of the non-app based users, they're a really small percentage of users. I can't give you specific numbers because all I hear is really small percentage, and they don't seem to know always exactly what that percentage looks like. But my understanding is they would just be left out of, unless you can. A lot of the surveys might be app based or email based, but if you're not connected in those ways, then no, they would be excluded from the surveys.
I have 2 questions also. One was, we had the overview of all the different aspects that you looked at of equity, right? And then you said, well, the data sharing, that's not really part of the equity. I wanted to ask you on that, but why not? And what are we looking at when we are looking at sharing the data? And is the data that we're sharing, right? Are we able to share apples to apples, or are we really doing apples to different type of fruit? And then the second question was, while you're doing this study, are you also using these vehicles yourself? Or doing besides leisure trips, maybe also multimodal trips with them? And if so, or if not, would you? And if so, what have been your experiences? And comparing that to your research.
Sure. Well, from the data side, we didn't include the data as an equity requirement because it really depends on how you use the data. Because people they're not explicitly collecting these to say who's enrolling in the reduced fare programs. Occasionally cities were doing that, very rarely. They were just collecting general trip data, and you can ask equity-based questions with those data, like how are trips distributed across space, what neighborhoods are using trips, et cetera. But they're not by definition equity. So it's how you use the data really, more than that. I 100% agree. They're a really important part of any kind of equity assessment, and to actually assess anything, right, or evaluate. But that's why we didn't group it under that. If we don't consider an equity requirement by definition.
Right.
An important tool, but not a requirement.
So how about the transparency of it? Would you consider that the equity part, or?
It certainly can be, but again, some of those reports didn't look at equity at all. Some of the reports that cities publish are just very, here's how many trips there were, here's how the average distance, here's the average time, here's the time of day distribution, and they didn't look at equity. So again, the reports can
Yeah, I was thinking
have an
more
equity transparency lens, but don't have to.
in terms of allowing people to look into what these companies are doing, seeing that as an equity component.
Perhaps, I mean,
Yeah.
I think I'm really concerned, but this research really focuses on the user, right?
Yeah,
And so that could be a good question for the city to think about, you know, do we continue with these contracts? Are these companies serving the city and the citizens well? That's a, I mean, that potentially a higher level question. I
Yeah.
mean, I think more transparency is almost better anyway. So certainly would love to see all those reports and all the data. But it's not necessarily something that is the most critical piece of all this, but certainly again, another tool in the box. And my own personal experience, I have ridden a scooter once
okay.
and found it to be terrifying. So again, very interested how other people use them. I have never been the most coordinated of humans, so that's part of it possibly. And then I do ride my bike to and from work every day, but I ride my own bike, and Eugene is very small footprint, and so, and there's also not bike share in my neighborhood. The bike share system stops like a half a mile from my neighborhood, so I ride my own bike, and when I have friends and family come in town, then I rent like 6 bike share bikes, and we all go out in a little fleet of bikes and explore the city together, which is pretty fun. So you can rent multiple bikes on the bike share system. But yeah, I'm definitely a bike person, and don't myself feel as comfortable on scooters, but to each their own. That's how I always think about it.
It's Tim, you have a question?
Yes, I was curious about, so I think it was city of San Francisco, and I forget where else, city of Austin. And they required these shared mobility companies to provide discounted or free rides to to members of the population that met a certain threshold for their income, or should I say did not meet a certain threshold. Do you have any idea how these companies actually implement that? I mean, are people required to submit their tax returns from the previous year, just input their most recent pay stub?
It depends a lot again on the city. I mean, I will say there's some places, for example, Eugene's bike share likes to say it has a reduced fare rate for people who qualify, and yet they have no way for people to validate their income.
Yes.
And so they have it, but no one uses it because there's no way to validate the income. And so they don't actually have it, but they like to say they have it.
Okay.
I think that's an exception. I think that has to do with the history of Eugene transitioning from a private to a nonprofit and just not kind of scrambling to catch up. Other ones, some link it to other programs. So if you're enrolled in SNAP, or if you're enrolled in, say, energy assistance programs, you have to bring some other evidence of being enrolled in another program, or, you know, being part of subsidized housing. You automatically qualify with any proof of that. Other ones, usually they have a required list of documentation that you have to bring either in person or some is via email. So it really ranges. And I think it's an important point to think about. Great, you have this, but is it actually useful, or is it accessible, or are people actually, do they know it exists, right? Where is it advertised on the website? I mean, sometimes you would see nowhere on a program website that they had a reduced fare, and I then talk to staff, they say, oh yeah, we have that. I go, well, how am I supposed to know that, right? I'm looking very purposely for it. And so, you know, again, thinking about that full picture is, what does that actually look like? So one of my next projects is working, Lime and Bird agreed to give us a bunch of data to then look at, hopefully, trips across the whole country, so we can identify, think about how might we as researchers measure equity across programs, and then try to identify the programs that seem to be doing well across different metrics, and then talk to city staff, agency staff, community groups, and figure out like what's actually happening that seems to be making this work well. My hypothesis is that you can have 2 different requirements on paper that end up looking very different in practice. So my question is why? And how do you actually get to the more positive outcome versus the more superficial, yeah, we have it, but it doesn't actually help anyone. So that's the next step.
Okay. Let's turn to some questions online.
So I apologize if you answered this. It's a lot of information. So you mentioned that smaller, less urban communities often don't dare impose equity requirements for fear of not being served by micromobility operators. Have you seen successful strategies for such communities to address this?
Yeah, so I'd say, having talked to city staff, that's a fear that I've heard voiced from them. But we looked at all the population of the places where there's equity requirements, and we just ran a quick correlation, and there's no correlation between population size and having equity requirements. So clearly smaller communities are very successful at implementing equity requirements. I think there's just a fear among some, either mid-sized or smaller cities, that no one's gonna come serve our market, let's just not ask for much. There's plenty of evidence from other similarly sized places that you should go for it. It works quite well. And the staff that I've talked to, one, again, they're a small community, one, they'd had a failed search earlier, a couple of years previously, and so we're just very worried that they would have another failed search for an operator. And so we're just saying, let's just ask for the bare minimum and hopefully get at least one operator to come in. So I think it varies by context and potentially staff memory as well.
All right, and there's another question. Just to clarify, would a cash option, so open quote cash option, close quote, be a open quote smartphone alternative, close quote? So
Not necessarily.
okay.
Yeah, so we separated those out because, for example, you can have a smartphone alternative. Often they go hand in hand. They're often required by the same programs. But for example, you can have something that requires no smartphone, but a credit card. Or you can have a smartphone. If you have a smartphone, you really have to have a credit card. So in some ways they're not totally unlinked in terms of getting money onto that smartphone. In some cases, you can do things like, or if you have a smartphone alternative, for example, you can have a card, a transit card, which again, you can typically load with cash other places. So that often companies will use that as a combined, meeting that requirement combined, but they can be distinct. So again, if you could tap on the back with a credit card, for example, but there's nowhere to load cash, there's no alternative to say, tapping on a reader on the back of a bike, for example. Or for example, if maybe you could load something with cash at a 7-Eleven, but how do you unlock the bike? If you need an app to then unlock the bike, even if you've loaded your account with cash, there's a disconnect there. So oftentimes, those are the two most common requirements. And so often cities are requiring them in conjunction. And I think the solution can sometimes be in conjunction, but they are distinct.
Yep.
Okay. So it says here, perhaps out of scope for this presentation, but could you talk about how much scooters contribute to the accessibility of disadvantaged communities compared to how much bikes contribute?
I have no idea.
Okay.
And that's partly because we don't have great data. When we look at who uses the surveys, at least that exist, of who uses scooters and bikes, they seem to be different populations in a lot of ways. So different people tend to, something like bikes, something like scooters, but it varies a lot by the survey. It's, at least maybe other people know this better than I do. It seems to be hard to kind of pin this down. And I think a lot would come down to, what's the specific community needs and interests. When you look at, I have done research with my PhD student, CN Meng. He and I looked at docked versus dockless systems, not scooters versus bikes per se, although scooters are by definition dockless. You don't have to return them to a station. And we found that dockless systems provide more geographic equity, at least compared to docked systems. So there's more accessibility across space. And I think we did 7 or 8 US cities, so comparing those two modes. And if you think about just the capital costs of investing in a station, for example, it's much easier to go spread farther with the dockless systems. There's an important caveat to that, which is the service area. So where, for example, a city says that dockless scooters and bikes can operate, is typically much larger than where they actually operate. So you can be allowed to put a bike or scooter right outside here, for example, doesn't mean there actually will be one available. And so there's certainly there's a bit of a mismatch there, but if you're thinking about, the most expansive, and kind of to the narrowest geographical access, there's kind of the designated dockless area is the biggest geography and the most inclusive in terms of especially income and race. The next then was the actual operating area of dockless modes where the vehicles actually are, and then even smaller was the docked modes. Okay, so there is some thinking, you know, if those are scooters, the dockless ones, then they might provide more geographic access, but it's not by definition scooter, that can also be bikes.
I think I saw it.
Okay.
Tara first.
Thank you for the presentation. Do you think like a transversal of equity could be connectivity? Like if people, 'cause it's for leisure, you might go to a nice park and get a bike for a stroll. But if it's a daily need through snow and rain and with the kids, you know, having some sort of pass, like any initiative related to equity that it's multimodal. Has that been seen in any of your research as an equity factor?
I don't know if that's been studied as an equity factor, but certainly I think, you know, more choice in terms of the flexibility to meet people's different needs, trip purposes, and family dynamics. So allowing them to choose between different modes, be it transit, be it, you know, it's a little bit like mobility as a service. So picking that mode you need for your, you know, specific time, place, purpose, family. But I don't know of any research that's looked at that specific from an equity.
So if I may, from I believe there's like 11 factors you consider as to measure equity. Why wasn't like connectivity to transit or depending, right? How they're called it's one of them.
Well, I mean, it's not in typically the requirements themselves in the language. There's not a requirement to co-locate with transit, for example. We weren't looking at where vehicles are actually being placed. We're looking at where are they being required to be placed in certain neighborhoods, but typically in the language, they're not saying you must co-locate with transit. This is just not something the city's requiring.
Should.
That's the issue,
Yeah. Okay.
Or maybe not. I mean, could it also be you're putting it where transit isn't? I mean, it depends what's your goal for the micromobility.
But I don't know about other states, but at least in California, you know, transportation is done very regional, like BART, right? And then local and regional are sometimes two very different stories. If you look at some of the commissions and what they talk about with the different cities, and just sit in on those and see all the different responses, it's so complicated to get everyone on the same page.
Just from the BART to the Amtrak, I lost 2 hours and many appointments because there's no way to see the schedule of the next one.
Yeah.
I think connectivity should be a core.
Yeah.
That's
Take it up with the 240 cities.
There's so many layers of government and agencies, and I think that is, at least in our
Dictator.
region, a huge issue, yeah. Yeah.
Duncan?
I'm kind of curious, I'm sure this is easily findable on your database, but if you have a couple examples of some cities or programs that are really like exemplary in terms of the approach that they took to addressing equity in their program.
My ultimate favorite is Baltimore. That again, this was one of the staff person I mentioned who was just really thoughtful in implementing this. They just had thought about a lot of the different intersectional dimensions of equity and the you know, both the neighborhood side and the individual side. They also iterated their program a lot. And so they learned a lot and collected a lot of data, both on the survey side. So they're one of the cities that has the company survey people, so they know who the individuals are. But they also had done things like they realized when, for example, they were specifying equity zones, they observed things like, oh, there's a zone, but all of the scooters that are getting placed here are on this very edge of the zone. And they're not actually going into the zone, which is our intent. And so they spent a lot of time and effort analyzing data over time, iterating and thinking really specifically about what are our goals and who are we trying to reach. So they're one of my favorite. They also have some really interesting selection metrics for companies. So they do a lot of, they have a weighted criteria system and they weight equity very highly in terms of that. So how companies in their application talk about equity and say they'll address it. They prioritize that in the selection process. And there's other cities that do that as well, but if you're gonna look at one, they're my favorite.
Anyone else?
if I may.
One on the end.
And you just showed that like these programs are kind of like identity process. So when you are evaluating a program, so how you are actually integrating the findings from the evaluation in the next system.
How are they implementing the findings in the next system?
Yeah, findings from the evaluation. I mean,
Yeah.
For the next program.
Often they're doing it in the requirements themselves. So what they find from one iteration, they then build into the requirements for the next one. So if, for example, they found that maybe they didn't have a geographic equity requirement in the beginning, and they see, oh, we have no trips happening in this area of the city that's really underserved by our other transportation system. Let's make sure that this area gets included, and so they build that into the next round of requirements. And because these programs are often 1 to 2 year pilots, often 1 year, they have a pretty quick RFP, so request for proposal cycle, where they're constantly rebidding and contracting companies. And so it allows them a decent amount of flexibility. So the other thing I've heard from cities was they really recommend this iterative process in the beginning until you kind of figure out all the challenges you might encounter, and then you can go to a longer processing, a longer contracting period, 3 or 5 years, once you've had that time to iterate and work out some of the challenges. But yeah, they're building it right back into the requirements themselves.
Thank you. Another question I might have missed it, like about finding or like considering multi-language in the system. Simply how you are coming to the decision about how many languages or which languages would be included.
Great question. Some cities have, as a city policy, they have languages that they specify that public services, like their transit website or transit, et cetera, has to be in XYZ language. So some already have languages that at the broader city level, they typically engage with, maybe through public engagement or surveys, et cetera. Other ones, I have no idea how they pick those languages, right? There's a huge range. Sometimes they're languages that I would have been, that are widely spoken across the country. I've said, okay, that makes sense and seems reasonable. And other ones, I'm like, oh, there must be, populations in the city that I wasn't aware of, because there's these very, very targeted, specific languages called out in some cases that is quite interesting, that are, representing different, ethnic enclaves or immigrant populations or communities. It's a really interesting range across cities, but I think a lot of that comes down to the staff and what they themselves are putting into those contracts. Yeah, it's a good question, like who gets included and who doesn't again?
So there are 2 questions online. So the first one, do cities with bicycle share consistently include bicycling and bike share directions to their facilities, programs, and events?
Can you read that again?
That's what okay. Do cities with bicycle share consistently include bicycling and bike share in directions to their facilities, programs, and events?
Okay, so if there's a city event, like, are there bike directions included?
That's what I'm assuming.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'll
It's
tell
beyond
you,
the scope.
anecdotally, no one does that.
No
It's
one
one of
does
my
that, okay.
biggest pet peeves.
All right. And the next question. How are cities encouraging the safe usage of these new modes of transportation, particularly scooters? Are scooters to be used on sidewalks or bike lanes? Are cities hearing feedback from our ADA disabilities communities where people used wheelchair or electric chairs?
Okay, so there's a couple pieces in there. So can you start with the first part of that again?
Okay.
I'll go through one by one.
Okay, got it. So how are cities encouraging the safe usage of these new modes of transportation, particularly scooters?
Okay, so some require helmets, for example, and you can get a free helmet if you sign up, and they'll send you a free helmet. Most people don't use helmets while riding these. Some will require you to take a photo of yourself, and it'll validate, I guess, that you're wearing a helmet. Other ones, especially when you're taking a first ride, and this will sometimes be in city contracts, your very first ride, they'll reduce the speed of your first ride so you get used to it. Other ones will do things like geofence certain areas that you either can't ride, some pedestrian areas, or they'll say you can't go particularly, or you'll have a slow zone that you have to, it'll slow the vehicle automatically. Other ones, there's rider education. You have to watch little videos beforehand or have little reminders before you take a ride. Here's how to ride, quick tips, here's take a little quiz. Some of them, especially after certain times of day, will have essentially a sobriety check that comes up. And it'll say, I don't know exactly what those look like. I guess I'm not traveling late at night, or maybe there's no scooter. Can we have an example?
So
Lime and Isla Vista will ask you to type the word yes.
Okay.
To rent it.
Seems like you should hopefully be able to do that at all times, but
God,
they have
wow.
a check.
Yeah.
Sobriety
But if you
test.
miss it up, you can type it again, so.
Again, how effective are these?
Wow.
Yes, they build these things into varying degrees of success potentially. And then other times they're building protected infrastructures. A lot of cities have expanded the protected infrastructure. I think that relates to the second question, which is where should they be?
Yeah, should they be used on sidewalks or bike lanes? That was the second question.
Well, typically in transportation more broadly, mixing like speeds with like speeds is a safer option than mixing two modes that are going dissimilar speeds. And so generally, cities are prohibiting riding on sidewalks and encouraging riding in bike lanes / micromobility lanes, as some have rebranded them. So thinking about, again, who are you traveling similar speeds with? It's also been encouraging more creation of those, of separated infrastructure. And then the ADA question.
Right, so the ADA one was, are cities hearing feedback from our ADA disabilities communities where people use wheelchairs or electric chairs?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the regulations are around thinking about how to keep that thoroughfare clear, and a lot of the regulations are related to ADA, so it's requiring at least 36 inches of clearance, specifically related to ADA, minimum ADA clearance guidelines. That said, when I've looked at regulations, it's interesting to think about what are we requiring scooters, especially parking side, what's being required versus what's not. So I've talked with a group in Oregon called Disability Rights Oregon about scooters, and it was interesting, they said things like scooters against building walls, which only 30%, I looked at, what cities did I look at? I looked at about 32 cities in the US and their regulations, and only about a third of them said you cannot park against a building wall. A lot of people with sight impairments or lower vision use the side of building walls to navigate. And so that's a huge failing then. That's gonna be a huge barrier and impediment. If you're not expecting something to be parked along a building wall and you're using it to navigate. And so, that is something that is not built into a lot of requirements. Similarly, they mentioned the orientation of scooters. Again, they were focused on basically sight-related disability, but having it oriented perpendicular to the curb versus parallel created different tripping hazard potential. So that wasn't, just this unexpected object in the right of way. But then they broadened this discussion again, thinking about there's all sorts of things in our right of way that are a problem. And you can also think back to lock-to requirements, right? If there's a scooter that is in the middle of the sidewalk, if it's locked to something, you can't move it, right? Versus if it's in the middle of something and we don't want it in the middle of the sidewalk, but if it's in the middle of the sidewalk and not locked to something, you can move it. Remember, just having a lock-to mechanism doesn't mean it's being locked to anything. You can just close the lock right here. Right, so it's not saying there has to actually be locked to something to lock it. So there's a lot of dimensions there, but I think cities are certainly considering the ADA, but I think again there's some missing gaps.
Do one more from the room.
So thank you, Anna. My last question would be, so we didn't talk much in the presentation about the costs that we were talking about in lunch. So I don't know if part of the survey included, or for the cities, if they knew how much it cost them to implement the system, and then if they would get anything from the companies or any information of the operation, and if there's a way to link something about that towards how equitable the system is.
You read one of my future projects. Yes, you read my mind. So I have a meeting on Wednesday to discuss this with some potential collaborators, which is just that. So thinking about not necessarily the cost, because most of these, unless they're run by the city, so if they're run by the city, which tends to be bike share, there is a cost. Usually they have a sponsor. That's the historical model of bike shares. There's a big keystone sponsor, often a health related or healthcare related entity. So that's a different model. I'm going to focus on just the private only side. I don't know any city that doesn't collect any fees. Most collect fees, and that is, it's not clear exactly what the different structures look like. Most collect things like by trip, by rider. Some collect, Denver collects a lump sum per year. The only one I know that collects a lump sum, but most is tied to use. And then the question is, where does that money go?
So that's what this project is hoping to look at. What I hear from cities is that it funds things like staff time to manage programs, infrastructure, maybe some community outreach. So again, how that relates to equity, I'm curious about, what communities are being are having outreach through the funds. And also things like, can you actually trace the money that comes in for infrastructure and think about where that actually is going? Is it just going to the neighborhoods that have really robust infrastructure already, or is it expanding, safe and separated infrastructure to places that don't have it? So that's an outstanding question. I'm not sure we can answer it or not. I'm not sure if it just goes into this big pot of money and then you can't trace it from there, but it's something we're gonna be looking into.
Well, with that, we're out of time for today, so thanks again, Anne,
Thanks
for
all.
coming and sharing.